Chicago, 1931. A line of men waits outside a courthouse. Some hold newspapers. Some hold their breath. Cameras flash. People do not come to see a hero. They come to see a legend fall. Inside, a man sits very still. He wears a clean suit. His hair is neat. His face is calm, but his eyes are tired. This is Al Capone. For years, many people called him the most powerful gangster in America. They linked his name to Prohibition-era Chicago and the Chicago outfit. They said he was untouchable. But today, the danger is not a gun. It is paper. The strange truth about Al Capone is this. He did not lose his freedom because a witness finally spoke. He lost it because the government found a path through numbers and records. The same man who could scare people with his reputation could not scare facts written in ink. That is why his story still pulls people in. It is about power, pride, and the moment a person learns that time always wins. To understand how Al Capone reached this room, the story goes back to Brooklyn, New York. He was born in 1899. His parents were immigrants from Italy. They worked hard and wanted a stable life. The neighborhood was crowded and loud. Life was not easy, but people learned to stand their ground as a boy. Al could learn in school, but the streets taught faster lessons. On the streets, respect mattered. If someone insulted a boy, others watched the response. Weakness invited trouble. Strength could buy safety. Many young men learned to look brave, even when they felt fear. Inside, Al grew up with a quick temper. He wanted to be noticed. Over time, he drifted away from school. He spent more time outside, where older boys talked about easy money. They spoke of clubs, back rooms, and jobs that were not honest. They called it opportunity, not wrongdoing. Soon, Al joined groups of young men who lived by street rules. They were not famous yet. They were not rich. But they believed they could become both. For Al, the idea of a normal life started to feel too small. He did not want to wait years for respect. He wanted it now. Then came the moment that marked him for life. One night, Al was working at a place where men drank and laughed. The air was thick with smoke and noise. A woman walked in, and Al made a rude comment. Her brother heard it. Words turned sharp. Tempers rose. In a flash, a blade cut Al's face. Blood ran. Pain burned. The fight ended, but the scar stayed. From then on, some people called him Scarface. It was not a name he loved. It was a label that followed him like a shadow. The scar changed how others looked at him. Some feared him more. Some mocked him. Either way, they noticed him. Around this time, Al met people with real influence in the underworld. One of them was Johnny Torrio, a man who planned more than he fought. Torrio believes power came from order. He focused on money, organization, and control. That way of thinking impressed Al. Then, a bigger change arrived. Prohibition in 1920. The United States banned the sale of alcohol. The law aimed to clean up society, but it created a new market overnight. People still wanted to drink. Parties did not end. Bars did not disappear. They moved into hidden rooms. A new world opened, and it needed people willing to take risks. Chicago was the perfect place for that world to grow. It was a busy city where money moved fast and rival groups fought for space. Or he went to Chicago and helped build an operation there. He called for Al to join him. Al was still young, but he had presence and loyalty. So he left New York and stepped into a city that felt like a doorway to everything he wanted. When Al arrived, he did not arrive as a king. He arrived as a hungry man with a scar, ready to prove himself. He watched. He listened. He learned who had money and who wanted more. At first, he told himself it was only business. He was not the one forcing anyone to drink. He was only meeting a demand. That excuse sounded clean in his head, but each step pulled him deeper. New friends came with hidden motives. New enemies watched. And every dollar earned in the dark carried a price. And slowly, the story began to turn. Because in Chicago, during Prohibition, alcohol was not just a drink. It was power. And for Al Capone, it became the road that led back to that courthouse seat, where paper waited like a trap. Al Capone did not rise in Chicago by accident. He rose because the city was full of open doors, and he had no fear of walking through them. In the early days, he was not the boss. He was a worker in a growing machine. But he learned quickly that the real power was not only in violence, it was in planning, money, and control. Chicago during Prohibition felt like two cities at once. In the daytime, it looked normal. Streetcars moved, shops opened, families went to work. But at night, another Chicago came alive. Hidden bars opened behind locked doors. Music played in back rooms. People laughed and drank like the law did not exist. Everyone wanted what was banned, and that meant someone would supply it. Johnny Torrio understood this better than most. He was calm and careful. He preferred order over chaos. He told Capone that a successful crime operation must run like a business. It needed steady supply lines, trusted workers, and strong protection. Torrio did not want endless street fights. He wanted a system that made money every day. Capone watched how Torrio handled people. Torrio spoke softly, but his words carried weight. He paid some officials to look away. He warned rivals not to cross certain lines. He made deals when possible, and he used force when necessary. Capone absorbed these lessons. He began to see that fear could open doors, but money could keep them open. Soon, Capone became more than a helper. He became the man Torrio could rely on in tough moments. Capone had energy, confidence, and a strong presence. He could speak to rough men and make them listen. He could also smile in public and act polite when it helped. That mix made him useful. But the city was not peaceful. Different gangs wanted the same territory. Alcohol brought huge profits, but it also brought endless conflict. One of the biggest threats came from rival groups, especially those led by men who refused to share power. These men believed Chicago should belong to them. Tension grew like a storm cloud. The more Capone's group earned, the more enemies appeared. A warehouse could be attacked, a truck could be stolen, a bar could be burned. Each small strike demanded a response, because weakness invited more attacks. In this world, silence could look like surrender. Capone saw the danger in every corner, but he also saw opportunity. He understood something important. People were afraid, and fear made them willing to pay for protection. If a business owner wanted to stay open, he might pay to be safe. If a politician wanted support, he might accept help from the wrong people. If a police officer wanted extra income, he might ignore certain crimes. Capone learned how to use all of this. He began building connections. Some people came willingly, attracted by money. Others came because they felt trapped. Capone's network grew street by street. He knew that a boss needed more than gunmen. He needed drivers, messengers, accountants, and people who could clean up problems fast. He needed places to store alcohol and people who could move it quietly. He needed someone in every corner who could call him with warnings. For a while, the plan worked. The operation expanded. Speakeasies multiplied. Trucks moved liquor at night. Cash poured in. Capone began living better than before. He wore fine clothes. He stayed in good hotels. He ate expensive meals. He started to look like a man who belonged at the top. But peace never lasts long in a city built on a legal business. One day, violence struck close. Torrio was attacked by rivals and barely survived. The message was clear. The war had reached a dangerous level. Torrio began to think differently. He had built the operation, but he did not want to die for it. He wanted to leave the battlefield while he still could. That decision changed Capone's life. Torrio stepped back and handed control to Capone. It was not a public ceremony. It was more like a quiet handover, the way a tired man passes a heavy load to someone younger. Capone accepted it. He was still in his 20s, but now he carried the weight of an empire. With that new power came new pressure. Capone had to protect territory, manage money, and keep rivals in check. He also had to deal with police and politicians. Every day became a balancing act. Too much violence brought attention. Too little violence invited attacks. He needed to look strong without causing a fire too big to control. Capone chose a bold approach. He wanted to be seen as untouchable. He made sure people knew he could punish enemies, but he also tried to shape his public image. He smiled for cameras. He donated money. He acted like a businessman, not a killer. Some people even admired him, because he seemed to provide jobs and keep certain streets calm. Yet underneath that polished surface, the truth stayed dark. Capone's rise depended on crime, threats, and fear. Each time he won, he created more enemies. Each time he expanded, he left more evidence behind. Even if the evidence was hidden, it existed. And while Capone worked to control the city began to study him. Reporters wrote stories. Police officers tracked rumors. Federal agents watched the money. Many people wanted to see him fall, not only because he was dangerous, but because he became a symbol of the law being broken. Capone did not panic. He believed he could handle anything, the way he always had. But Chicago was changing. The walls were closing in, slowly and quietly. The biggest threat was not always a rival gang in the street. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemy is the attention of an entire nation. After Johnny Torrio stepped away, Al Capone became the main name in Chicago's underworld. The change happened fast. One week, he was the strong right hand. The next week, he was the face everyone talked about. His enemies watched him closely. His friends expected him to leave, and the city itself seemed to lean in, waiting to see what kind of boss he would become. Capone understood one thing clearly. Power is not only about what a man can do, it is also about what people believe he can do. So he worked on both. In public, he tried to look like a successful businessman. He wore expensive suits and clean shoes. He smiled at events. He shook hands. He gave money to certain causes. He wanted the public to see a man who brought jobs and order, not chaos. Some people, tired of violence and poverty, believed the show. They said Capone was rough but fair. They said he helped people when the government did not. But in private, the world was not soft. It was sharp and hard and full of fear. Capone's operation grew wider. Alcohol moved through the city like a hidden river. Trucks carried it at night. Men guarded storerooms. Lookouts watched corners. Clubs opened behind secret doors. In those back rooms, the music was loud and the money was louder. Every bottle poured was another coin in Capone's pocket. Still, there was a problem that never went away. Rivals. Chicago was not a place with one gang. It was a place with many groups, each one hungry. Territories overlapped. Pride clashed. Old grudges stayed alive. And Prohibition made everything worse because it made the prize so large. Capone's main rivals did not just want to share. They wanted control. They wanted to prove he was not as strong as he appeared. In this world, a boss could not look weak for even one day. Weakness brought attacks. Attacks brought panic. Panic destroyed business. So Capone made choices that pulled him deeper into violence. There were meetings in dark rooms. There were warnings sent through messengers. There were deals offered and refused. And when talks failed, force followed. Capone's men carried guns. They did not only protect alcohol shipments, they protected the idea that Capone ruled. The city began to feel like a living alarm. People heard shots at night and then went quiet in the morning. Some store owners paid for protection, not because they loved Capone, but because they feared what happened if they refused. Some police officers looked away. Some politicians pretended they saw nothing. The streets learned a new kind of normal. Capone kept building his image while the danger rose around him. He used the press like a mirror. If a reporter came near, Capone gave a quote and a smile. He wanted to appear calm and confident, as if the whole city was under control. He understood that fear worked best when it looked effortless. But inside, he lived on pressure. Every day brought questions. Who was loyal? Who was talking? Who was planning an attack? Capone could not relax. He could not walk anywhere without guards. He could not trust every friendly face. He had money, but money also made him a target. In the underworld, success was like blood and water. Then the nation began to pay attention. Capone was no longer just a Chicago problem. He became a symbol of America's Prohibition era. People in other cities read about him. His name traveled through newspapers like a rumor that turned into a fact. Some Americans were shocked by the violence. Others were secretly fascinated. They hated what he represented. But they could not stop watching. That attention had a cost. The more famous Capone became, the harder it was to hide. A small gangster could blend in. A famous one could not. Every big move created a headline. Every rumor created questions. Every death brought anger. The pressure was no longer only from rival gangs. It was also from the public, from reporters, and from law enforcement that felt embarrassed. Capone tried to manage the heat by acting bigger than it. He hosted gatherings. He smiled for photographs. He spoke as if he was just another citizen. He wanted to control the story, but the story had its own force. As the violence in Chicago grew, people began to demand action. The city's leaders did not want to look weak. Federal agents started paying closer attention. They could not always prove the violence in court because witnesses were afraid and evidence disappeared, but they began to look for other ways to reach him. And this is where Capone made a mistake. Many powerful people make. He believed fear could solve every problem. Fear could silence a witness. Fear could scare a rival. Fear could even change a vote. But fear could not erase numbers. It could not erase patterns. And it could not erase money once it moved through banks, businesses, and accounts. Capone's operation created a large flow of cash. Cash is loud in the eyes of the government. Even if it is hidden, it leaves signs. It makes people ask questions. It makes investigators follow trails. Capone did not think much about that at first. He was focused on the street war and the daily business. He believed his power was enough to block any serious threat. He told himself the government had bigger problems than one man, but the government was learning a different lesson. If they could not catch him for violence, they could catch him another way. Meanwhile, Capone faced another problem. His enemies were not giving up. Rival groups kept pushing. They challenged his control. They tested his strength. They looked for the moment he would slip out, and Capone, feeling the pressure from all sides, started making decisions faster and harder. He began to strike first, to send messages, to make sure everyone understood the price of disloyalty. Chicago was moving toward a breaking point, because when a city lives in fear for too long, one event can change everything. One morning can turn into a national headline. One act can force the government to respond in a way it can no longer avoid. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Al Capone was still smiling for cameras, still acting like the king of Chicago while the trap was being built around him, piece by piece. The breaking point did not arrive with a warning. It arrived like a headline that hit the country in the face. Chicago had seen violence before. People had heard gunshots in the night and learned to stay quiet. They had read about gang fights and told themselves it was not their problem. But now, the violence felt different. It felt larger. It felt public. It felt like the city was losing control of itself. Al Capone was at the center of that fear. By this time, his name carried two meanings. To some, it meant protection and money. To others, it meant danger and death. Either way, everyone had an opinion. And the more people talked, the more pressure built. Capone tried to keep his world running smoothly. He expanded his control over alcohol, gambling, and protection rackets. The operation worked like a business. Men had roles. Routes were planned. Orders were clear. Money was counted and moved quickly. Capone understood that chaos destroyed profit, so he wanted order inside his own system. But outside his system, chaos kept growing. Rival gangs were not going to disappear. They watched Capone's moves and looked for weak spots. Sometimes they attacked shipments. Sometimes they threatened businesses that paid Capone. Sometimes they tried to kill people close to him. These attacks were not only about money, they were about pride. In the underworld, pride could start wars. Capone answered in the only way he believed would work. He answered with strength. He wanted rivals to fear him more than they hated him. He wanted them to think twice before crossing him. That meant punishments. That meant warning shots. That meant men in cars who showed up at the right moment. Capone did not always pull the trigger himself, but the city believed the violence flowed from him like an order. This belief made him powerful, but it also made him a target. Police and reporters followed him. Some officers were on his payroll, but not all. Some detectives wanted to make a name. Some newspaper editors wanted to sell more copies. Capone's face became a product. His story became entertainment. People talked about him at dinner tables like he was a character in a movie. Capone understood the value of publicity. He used it like a shield. He smiled for photos. He spoke calmly when asked questions. He acted friendly and confident. He wanted the public to think, he's too big to touch. And for a while, it worked. But fame has a hidden side. Fame brings attention from people who do not fear you. Fame brings pressure from leaders who feel embarrassed. Fame turns one man's crimes into a national problem. Capone began to feel that change. It showed up in the way officials spoke. It showed up in the way reporters wrote. It showed up in the way federal agents started watching his money. Still, Capone believed he could manage it. He had managed everything else. Then one violent event pushed the country over the edge. It was not just another shooting in a dark alley. It was an act that made the public feel the violence had crossed a line. The story spread quickly, and the fear spread with it. People began to say, enough. They began to demand action from the government. From that point, Chicago's gang wars were no longer just Chicago's problem. Officials were under pressure to respond. They could not ignore the violence. They could not pretend it was contained. The nation wanted a symbol of justice, and Capone was the biggest symbol of crime. But there was still a challenge. Proving Capone's crimes in court was difficult. Witnesses were afraid. Many people who knew the truth did not want to speak. Some had been threatened. Some had been paid. Some simply did not trust the system. Evidence could disappear. Stories could change overnight. The underworld had ways to create silence. So the government began thinking differently. Instead of chasing the gun, they chased the money. This was the shift that Capone did not fully respect. Capone's empire produced huge amounts of cash. Cash that bought cars and suits. Cash that paid workers and bribes. Cash that flowed through businesses. Even if it was hidden in back rooms and secret safes, it still left traces. It still created patterns. It still raised questions. Federal investigators understood something important. A man might avoid a murder charge, but he could not avoid a question about income forever. They looked for proof that Capone had earned money and failed to report it. They studied his lifestyle. They studied the people around him. They searched for ledgers and notes, anything that could show the movement of money. Capone, meanwhile, kept playing the same game. He focused on controlling the streets and winning the gang war. He believed his enemies were the rival bosses. He believed danger came from bullets. He did not fully accept that the real threat was a quiet office worker, sitting under a lamp, reading numbers on a page. As the pressure grew, Capone's life changed in small ways. He traveled with more guards. He trusted fewer people. He became more careful, but also more tense. He still smiled for cameras, but the smile did not always reach his eyes. He was living with two wars at once, the street war and the war of attention. And attention was becoming a weapon, because once the federal government decided it wanted Capone, it did not need to beat him at his own game. It only needed to wait, watch, and build a case that could survive in court. Capone's power had been built on fear and speed, but the government moved slowly, patiently. It was building a trap that did not depend on frightened witnesses or missing guns. It depended on facts that could be counted, and while Capone tried to stay on top, the trap grew stronger with every day, every payment, every hidden dollar. The city still feared him. The newspapers still wrote about him. But behind the scenes, a different story was forming. A story not of gunfire, but of numbers, and for the first time, Al Capone was facing an enemy he could not intimidate or outshoot. The federal pressure did not arrive like a loud raid with flashing lights. It arrived like a shadow that grew longer every day. At first, Al Capone treated the government's interests as a nuisance. He had dealt with police before. He had paid some. He had frightened others. He believed that, in the end, every threat could be handled the same way, with money, force, or influence. But the federal agents were not playing the same game. They did not need a scared witness to point a finger. They did not need a gun with fingerprints. They were building a case that could survive fear, bribes, and silence. They were looking at the part of Capone's world that could not hide forever. They were looking at the money. Capone's life looked expensive in a way that could not be explained by a normal job. He wore fine suits. He lived well. He moved with a group of men who acted like guards. Everyone in Chicago knew he controlled an illegal empire, even if they could not prove every detail in court. And the government began to ask one quiet question that carried great danger. If he lived like a rich man, where did the income come from? Capone's operation was built on cash and cash was both a strength and a weakness. Cash paid workers quickly. Cash was hard to track. Cash could disappear into pockets and safes. But cash also created patterns. It bought property. It paid bills. It kept businesses running. It moved through people, and people talked. Even if they did not talk to reporters, they talked to friends, to family, to strangers at bars. Loose talk was like a leak in a ship, small at first, then impossible to ignore. Federal investigators did not rush. They were patient. They collected pieces, one by one. They watched Capone's associates. They looked for records. They listened for names. They waited for someone inside the machine to make a mistake. Meanwhile, Capone tried to strengthen the image he showed to the public. He understood the power of a story. He knew the newspapers loved a clear villain, but he wanted to be seen as something else. He wanted to look like a strong man who brought order to chaos. He wanted people to believe he was part of the city, not a threat to it. So he did things that confused people. He smiled in public. He gave money away. He helped in moments when regular families were struggling. He did not only want loyalty from his men, he wanted approval from the crowd. In his mind, public support was another form of protection. But approval is not armor. It is only noise, and noise can change quickly. The more the country heard about gang violence, the less patience it had for the idea of Capone as a businessman. People did not live inside his deals. They lived beside the fear. They heard about shootings. They heard about bodies. They saw headlines and felt helpless. And when people feel helpless, they demand action. Capone saw the mood shifting. He also saw that his enemies were not only rival gangs anymore. He had enemies in offices and courtrooms, people who did not carry guns but carried authority. That type of enemy could not be threatened the usual way. Threatening them could backfire and bring more attention. So Capone tried another approach. Distance. He spoke less. He kept meetings tighter. He trusted fewer people. He told his men to be careful. He wanted the machine to run quietly, like a clock behind a wall. But a machine run by fear is never truly calm. Inside Capone's circle, tension grew. Men whispered about informants. They questioned who might be cooperating. They worried about raids. They worried about the simple fact that the empire was too large to stay invisible. Capone began to feel the pressure in his daily life. He could not sit in a restaurant without scanning faces. He could not travel without planning routes. He could not even relax at home without thinking about who had keys, who had access, who might be paid to betray him. Power had given him control, but it had stolen peace. As the federal case grew, Capone's world became smaller, not in money, not in territory, but in trust. He trusted his closest men, but even that trust had limits. A boss knows that loyalty can be real, but loyalty can also be rented. And the government did not need everyone to talk. It needed only one person, one record, one set of numbers that made the story undeniable. Capone also made a mistake that many powerful people make. He began to believe his own legend. He had survived street wars. He had outlasted rivals. He had walked through danger and come out smiling. Over time, he started to think he was protected by something greater than strategy. It felt like destiny. It felt like he could always find a way out. That belief can be comforting, but it can also be deadly. It makes a man slow to change. It makes him ignore small signs that point to a bigger truth. And there were signs. Sometimes, a friend would warn him that the government was digging deeper. Sometimes a lawyer would suggest more caution. Sometimes a business partner would suddenly become nervous and distant. These were small signals, but they all carried the same meaning. The world was tightening, still. Capone stayed focused on the visible threats. He watched rival gangs. He watched the streets. He watched the police. He did not fully understand the danger of the invisible threat, the slow, careful work of a federal investigation. The government's plan was simple in a cold way. If Capone could not be nailed to a specific violent act, he could still be held responsible for something else. The government could claim he had earned money and refused to report it. It could treat him like a man who believed rules did not apply, because tax, law did not need a witness to describe a shooting. It needed records, patterns, and proof of income. And the investigators kept hunting those things. They searched for ledgers. They searched for notes. They searched for anyone who had ever handled Capone's money and might now be scared enough to talk. They treated his empire like a puzzle, and they refused to stop until the pieces formed a clear picture. Capone felt the shadow over him, but he did not know how close it was. He still had men. He still had money. He still had influence. On the outside, he looked strong, but inside, the fear was changing shape. It was no longer the fear of a rival's gun. It was the fear of a courtroom, because Capone was beginning to realize a hard truth. He could control streets with force, but he could not control a country that had decided it needed an example. And when a government chooses an example, it does not chase quickly. It builds carefully. It waits. It gathers proof. It prepares the moment when the legend will finally have to sit still, under bright lights, and answer questions that cannot be dodged with a smile. The shadow finally stepped into the light. For months, federal investigators worked quietly. They did not chase Capone through alleys. They did not try to trap him in a shootout. They did something slower and more dangerous. They built a story using facts that could be counted. They followed money the way a hunter follows footprints in fresh snow. And little by little, the footprints formed a path straight to Al Capone. Capone heard rumors that the government was coming. He heard names of agents. He heard talk about tax charges. At first, he laughed it off. He told people that the government had no witnesses. He said they had nothing that could stick. He had faced trouble before, and he was still standing. But this time was different. The government was not asking, "Did you order this shooting?" The government was asking, "How did you pay for your life?" That question was harder to escape. Capone's lifestyle was loud. Even if he tried to stay quiet, his money spoke for him. The nice clothes, the expensive trips, the big meals, the people around him, the way he lived did not match any legal job. The government did not need to prove every crime behind his wealth. It only needed to prove that he earned income and did not report it. Capone's lawyers began to worry. They warned him that federal cases were not like local problems. They explained that the government had time, resources, and patience. It could keep pushing until it found a weak spot. Capone listened, but he did not show fear. He hated the idea of looking worried. A boss lived on confidence. If he looked nervous, his men would feel it. If his men felt it, his enemies would sense it. And if his enemies sensed it, they would move. So Capone stayed calm in public. He walked into buildings with his head up. He greeted people like he owned the room. He smiled at reporters. Sometimes he even joked. He acted like a man who had already won. But behind closed doors, his circle grew tense. His advisors argued about what to do next. Some said he should fight. Some said he should negotiate. Others said he should disappear for a while. But disappearing could make him look guilty. Fighting could bring a bigger storm. Negotiating could make him seem weak. Every option had a cost. Then came the moment that changed everything. The government formally moved against him. Capone was charged with tax-related crimes. The news spread fast. Newspapers printed his name in bold letters. People lined up to hear updates. Some were shocked. Some were happy. Some were simply curious. His story had become a national drama. Capone understood the danger, but he also believed he could still win. He had money for the best lawyers. He had influence. He had beaten cases before. He told himself this would be the same. Still, the fear in his world kept growing. The reason was simple. A murder case could fall apart if a witness stayed silent, but a tax case could be built on documents, ledgers, and patterns. Papers did not get scared. Papers did not forget. Papers did not change their story overnight. The government's plan was clear. It wanted to show that Capone had a steady flow of income. It wanted to show he did not report it. It wanted to show that the law applied to him, no matter how famous he was. Capone's team tried to prepare. They searched for weak points in the government's case. They looked for errors. They looked for ways to delay. They looked for deals. They wanted to reduce the damage. At one point, there were talks about a plea agreement. The idea of a deal hung in the air like smoke. If Capone admitted guilt, he might get a lighter sentence. If he fought and lost, the punishment could be worse. But Capone was a man who had built his name on strength. Admitting guilt felt like surrender. He did not want to be remembered as a man who gave up, so he leaned toward fighting as the court date neared. The tension hit him in a personal way. He could no longer treat the pressure like a distant threat. It was now on his calendar. It was now in his mailbox. It was now in the faces of the men around him. The law had stepped onto his territory, and it was not leaving. Capone began to notice things he had ignored before. Small signs. Small changes. A friend who used to laugh easily now spoke carefully. A business partner avoided long conversations. A man who once seemed loyal began to act nervous. The circle around Capone felt tighter, and the air inside it felt heavy. He started to understand a painful truth about power. When a man rises fast, many people come close. Some come for love. Some come for money. Some come for safety. But when danger arrives, those people do not all stay. Some run, some hide, some betray, and a powerful man can never be fully sure. Which one is which? The world that once felt exciting began to feel like a cage. Capone still had money. He still had men. But he could not buy peace. He could not order the government to stop. He could not threaten a system that was built to outlast him. And for the first time in a long time, Capone felt something deeper than fear. He felt uncertainty. It was not the uncertainty of losing a fight in the street. He knew how to handle that. This was different. This was the uncertainty of sitting in a courtroom where the rules were not his. The closer the trial came, the more he realized the truth of his situation. The story was no longer about how powerful he looked. It was about what could be proven, and the government believed it could prove enough. Soon, the cameras would flash again. The courtroom would fill. The judge would speak. The papers would be read aloud. The world would watch the legend stand still. And Al Capone, who had spent years controlling everyone else's choices, would face the one place where he could not control the outcome. The courtroom felt colder than the streets of Chicago. It was not cold from weather. It was cold from silence, rules, and the simple fact that no one inside feared Al Capone the way people did outside. Capone walked in wearing a good suit, as always. He kept his shoulders straight. He kept his face calm. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. Some people expected him to smile like he used to. Some expected anger, but Capone showed neither. He looked like a man holding his breath. He had been powerful for so long that sitting still felt unnatural. In his world, he gave orders and others moved. Here, he had to wait while other men spoke. Here, the judge sat above him. Here, the words objection and sustained mattered. More than threats. The government's case did not look like the stories people heard about gangsters. There were no dramatic confessions. There were no loud speeches about street wars. Instead, there were numbers, records, income, documents. A careful picture of money earned and money not reported. Too many people watching. It seemed strange. This was the man the country feared, and the weapon used against him was paperwork. Capone's lawyers fought hard. They tried to weaken the government's story. They questioned details. They argued about proof. They tried to make the case feel uncertain. They wanted one crack in the wall, because one crack could be enough to bring the whole case down. Capone sat and listened. He leaned toward his lawyers at times, speaking in low voices. He watched the faces of the jurors, looking for signs. Did they believe him? Did they hate him? Did they fear him? He needed them to doubt. In court, doubt was protection. But Capone faced a problem he could not solve with charm. The jurors did not need to like him. They only needed to believe the government's evidence. And the government's evidence was built to survive pressure. It was calm. It was steady. It did not change its story. Capone tried to stay confident. Yet, each day in court took something from him. He could feel control slipping away. Not through violence, but through time. Day after day, the process continued. He could not speed it up. He could not stop it. He could only sit and hope. Then something happened that shook him more than he expected. The court took steps to protect the case from outside influence. Decisions were made to reduce the risk of intimidation or manipulation. Capone, who had spent years believing he could shape outcomes, began to understand that this trial was built to resist him. That realization was the emotional turning point. It did not break him in public. He still held his posture. He still looked composed. But inside, something changed. He started to feel the weight of a truth he had avoided. In this room, His name was not a shield. It was a target. The government's message was simple. No matter how famous he was not above the rules. Not this time. As the days passed, the public followed every update. People talked about the trial in cafes, barbershops, and living rooms. Some were satisfied to see him in court. Some were disappointed because they wanted a more dramatic charge. Others watched for a different reason. They wanted to know if a powerful man could finally be held accountable. Capone's world narrowed even more. His life became a schedule of court hours and legal talks. The streets that once belonged to him were now far away. The noise of the city could not help him hear. The fear he built could not enter this room. Finally, the moment arrived. The jury reached a decision. Capone sat still as the words were read. His face did not explode with emotion. He did not shout. He did not beg. He only stared ahead, as if he was trying to understand how a life so full of motion could stop so suddenly. He was found guilty. For a second, the room seemed to freeze. Then the sound returned, papers moving, people whispering, reporters rushing out to send the news. Capone's lawyers continued to work, trying to reduce the damage. They argued for mercy. They looked for ways to soften the punishment. But the system was now moving forward, and it had momentum. When the sentence was announced, it landed like a final blow. Capone, the man who once lived like a king, was going to prison. As he was led away, the difference between legend and reality became clear. Outside, he had built an image of power. Inside the law, he was now just another defendant who lost. Prison was not a place where his old rules mattered. There were gates, schedules, and guards. There were numbers assigned to men. There were routines that swallowed days whole. The respect he once demanded was not guaranteed. In prison, everyone had a past, and many men were dangerous in their own way. Capone tried to adjust. At first, he believed he could still find comfort through influence. He had money. He had connections. But prison was designed to remove the tools that made him powerful. Money could not buy freedom. Reputation could not change locked doors. As time passed, the government moved him to a prison with stricter control. This was not a place built for deals. It was built for isolation, discipline, and silence. It was built to cut men off from the world they once controlled. And that is where Capone began to change. Not in a heroic way, not in a sudden movie moment, but in a quiet, human way. The longer he stayed behind bars, the more he seemed to shrink from the giant story people had told about him. He thought about Chicago. He thought about the choices that built his empire. He thought about the people he trusted and the people who disappeared. He thought about the strange way everything ended, not with a final gunfight, but with the slow grind of law and time in the outside world. Some people celebrated his fall. Others simply moved on. New names rose. New crimes replaced old ones. Chicago kept breathing. But for Capone, the world was now measured in smaller things. Morning counts, locked doors, and long hours to think. And in those long hours, one question followed him like an echo. If a man can control a city, but cannot control his own ending, what was the power worth? Prison did not feel real to Al Capone at first. It felt like a strange pause, like life had been stopped and rewound into a smaller room. He had lived for years with noise around him, cars, guards, meetings, late nights, whispered plans. Now, the world was quiet, controlled, and counted. In prison, time moved differently. It did not rush. It did not bend for anyone. It moved at the same speed every day. Like a heavy clock that never broke. Capone still had his famous name, but in prison, a name could not unlock a door. It could not cancel a rule. It could not erase a sentence. The guards did not speak to him like a powerful man. They spoke to him like a prisoner. That was the first shock. Respect was no longer automatic. It had to be earned in a place where everyone carried their own story of violence, pride, and loss. At first, Capone tried to hold on to the old habits of control. He stayed alert. He watched people closely. He listened more than he spoke. He looked for ways to make life easier, ways to find comfort, ways to rebuild some kind of influence. But prison was built to strip comfort away. Food was simple. Days were scheduled. Privacy was limited. A man could not choose his mornings or his nights. He could not decide who stood near him. He could not choose when to be alone. Even sleep felt different, because the mind stayed busy, and the body could not relax. Capone was used to moving pieces on a board. Now he was a piece moved by others. For a time, some prisoners treated him like a celebrity. They stared. They whispered. A few wanted to prove themselves by challenging him. Others wanted to stand near him because they believed his name still carried power. Capone had to manage these reactions carefully. Too much pride could invite trouble. Too much softness could invite disrespect, so he balanced. He stayed calm. He tried to keep his distance from drama. He focused on surviving. But survival is not only about fights. Sometimes it is about the mind. In those first months, Capone's thoughts became louder than the prison itself. He replayed choices from the past like scenes that would not stop. He remembered the early days in Brooklyn, the first big money, the nights when Chicago felt like his. He remembered faces that had vanished and voices that had been silenced. He also remembered the courthouse, the final feeling of sitting under bright lights while men read numbers that could not be argued with. That moment had changed him. It had shown him that even the strongest reputation could be made powerless by a system that refused to blink that. The government wanted more than punishment. It wanted separation. It wanted to remove him from the world he once controlled. So later, he was transferred to a place known for strict discipline and isolation. Alcatraz, the prison, stood like a hard stone on water, surrounded by cold currents. It was famous for one reason. It was designed to break the idea of escape. It was built to keep dangerous men away from influence, away from their networks, away from the comfort of being feared. When Capone arrived, the reality hit him in a new way. Alcatraz was not a place where he could negotiate daily life. It was not a place where a man could expect favors. The routine was firm. The rules were tight. The environment was heavy with control. In a place like that, Capone faced a painful truth. His old life was gone. No more late-night meetings. No more public smiles. No more feeling that the city was watching him with a mixture of fear and fascination. In Alcatraz, he was not a headline. He was a man in a cell. At first he tried to keep his dignity. He kept his clothes neat. He carried himself with quiet pride. But prison does not care about pride. It wears down the strongest spirit by making every day feel the same. Over time, Capone began to change. The change was not dramatic. It was slow and human. His energy dropped. His focus weakened. He became less sharp in conversation. Some days, he seemed lost inside his own thoughts. People around him noticed it. Even those who disliked him could see something fading. His health began to decline. The details of his medical condition were not something he could control with money. The body has its own rules, and the body does not care about power. As months turned into years, Capone's strength was no longer the strength of a man who commanded others. It became the strength of a man trying to hold himself together. In the outside world, many people still spoke about him like a monster. Others spoke about him like a legend. But inside prison walls, he was neither. He was simply a man aging under pressure, living with the weight of the past, and the past was heavy. Capone began to understand something he had never wanted to face when he was free. The empire he built was never stable. It was always built on fear, and fear creates enemies. Fear creates betrayal. Fear creates a life where a man must always look over his shoulder. Now, in prison, he did not need to look over his shoulder for rival gangs. But he could not escape the rival inside him, the part that still wanted control, still wanted to be important, still wanted to believe the story of Capone, the untouchable. That story was dying. In quiet moments, he thought about the people he left behind. He thought about his family. He thought about the city. He thought about how quickly a new name could replace an old one in the criminal world. He had once believed his power would last. Now he saw that power is temporary, and the world always moves on. He also thought about the strange ending of his rise. For years, people had expected that if Capone fell, it would be loud, a final shootout, a betrayal, a dramatic capture. But his fall had been different. It had been slow and silent, built by investigators and documents and laws. That ending carried a lesson he could not ignore. A man can create chaos, but he cannot control consequences forever. As Capone sat in his cell, the legend outside continued to grow in people's imaginations. But inside, the man was shrinking into something more ordinary. Not harmless, not innocent, just human. And in that humanity, the final part of his story began to come into view. Because prison did not only take away his freedom, it took away the stage. And without the stage, there was nothing left to perform only the truth of what remained when the lights went out. By the time Al Capone reached the later years of his sentence, the most shocking change was not the walls around him, it was the change inside him. In the early days, he had carried himself like a man who could still control the room. He watched everyone. He measured every word. He tried to hold on to the idea that he was still Capone, the same powerful figure people feared in Chicago. But prison does something that bullets cannot do. It slows a man down. It removes his stage. It takes away the crowd, the noise, the deals, and the constant motion that once made him feel important. In that silence, reality becomes louder than any headline. Day after day, Capone's world stayed the same. The same meals, the same rules, the same locked doors, the same long hours, with nothing to do but think. And thinking became its own kind of punishment. He began to drift into memories more often. He would remember the bright lights of nightclubs, the rush of money, the feeling of being untouchable. He would remember the street wars, the tension, the faces of men who were loyal one day and gone the next. He would remember how easy it was to believe he could outsmart everyone forever. But the truth had already proven itself. He had not outsmarted time. He had not outsmarted the government. And he had not outsmarted his own choices. As the years passed, Capone's health got worse. He did not look like the strong man from the photographs. He tired more easily. His focus was not the same. Sometimes he seemed confused, as if his mind was not holding on to the present the way it used to. Men around him noticed. Guards noticed. Even people who had no sympathy could see the difference. The famous gangster, who once ruled through confidence, now looked like a man being slowly worn down by his own body. In a strange way, that decline changed the atmosphere around him. Some inmates still hated him. Some still feared him. But others simply saw him as a prisoner who had lost the power he once used to hurt people. The legend did not match the reality in front of him. And reality is harder to worship outside the prison. The world moved on without him. Chicago did not stop. Prohibition ended. New problems came. New criminals rose. New headlines replaced old ones. People still remembered Capone's name, but the city's attention shifted, as it always does. Even fear has a short memory when life demands the next thing. Capone's greatest fear was not dying in prison. It was being forgotten. It was being replaced. In the criminal world, a man's power lasts only as long as he can use it. Once he is removed, the money keeps moving, but it moves around someone else. His old territory becomes another man's prize. His old friends become cautious. His old enemies become brave. And while Capone sat behind walls, he could do nothing about it. Eventually, the end of his prison time came into view. This was not a victory. It was more like a quiet closing of a chapter. The government had made its point. The empire had collapsed. The public had moved on. The question now was simple. What kind of life does a man have after being a symbol? When Capone was finally released, he did not step out into the same world he had left. He stepped into a different America, and he was a different man. There were no crowds cheering. There was no grand return. There was only a quiet exit into ordinary life, the kind of life he had rejected when he was young. The irony was hard to miss. In the end, the man who chased power and fame was pushed back toward anonymity. Capone returned to his family, but even family life could not bring back what had been lost. The years had taken a toll. His strength was not the same. His mind was not as sharp. He could no longer run an operation, even if he had wanted to. The criminal world does not pause and wait for a man to heal. It replaces him. For Capone, the quiet was now permanent. He spent time away from the old streets and old faces. He stayed out of the spotlight, partly because the spotlight no longer served him, and partly because it could only remind him of what he used to be. He had once commanded attention. Now attention would only ask questions he could not answer. People still spoke about him, but it was different. They spoke about him in the past tense, like a story that had already ended. And in a way, it had died as his condition worsened. The gap between the myth and the man became even larger. The myth was still big, still loud, still dressed in fine suits and surrounded by guards. The man, in real life, was smaller, quieter, more fragile, more human. That is one of the strangest parts of Al Capone's biography. His ending did not match the image the world had built. Many people imagined he would go out with violence. They imagined a final betrayal, a final shootout, a final dramatic moment. But his real ending was slow, calm, and private. No gunfire, no sirens, no big speech, just time doing what it always does, taking away the things a man thinks he owns. When Capone died, the country did not stop. Chicago did not freeze. The world did not hold its breath. The story had already been processed by the public long before his final day. He had become history while he was still alive. And that may have been the hardest truth of all, because in the end, Al Capone did not lose only his freedom. He lost his identity. He lost the ability to shape the world around him. He lost the feeling that his name could move people like a weapon. All that remained was the question. His story leaves behind, was he a powerful man who broke the rules, or a broken man who chased power until it broke him? In part 10, the story reaches its final meaning. What Capone's life became in the public memory, what people get wrong, what people get right, and why his name still pulls viewers in today. Al Capone's story ends quietly, but it does not disappear. In fact, the quiet ending is one reason people still talk about him. Many lives end in silence. Capone's life became famous, so people expected a loud ending. They expected drama. They expected violence. Instead, they got something simple and human. Time, illness, and a man fading away from the world he once tried to control. After his release, Capone was not the same man. He did not return to Chicago as a king. He did not take back his old power. The criminal world had already moved on. New leaders had taken space. New deals had been made. New names were now whispered in dark rooms. Capone's name was still famous, but fame is not the same as control. He spent his later years away from the noise. He stayed close to his family. He tried to live a private life, but privacy can be hard for a man who once lived as a symbol. People still watched. People still talked. Some wanted to see if he would rise again. Others wanted to see him suffer. Many were just curious. But Capone did not rise again. His health did not allow it. His strength was not there. His mind was not as sharp as before. The same man who once managed an empire could now struggle with simple moments. And that is the final twist of his biography. The legendary gangster became an ordinary man who could not fight back against his own body. When he died, his death did not cause a new war. It did not create a national shock. The country had already moved forward. Prohibition was gone. The gang wars of that era were no longer the main story. Capone's name had turned into history while he was still alive. Yet, even when a man becomes history, his image can live longer than his truth. That is why Al Capone remains one of the most searched names in gangster history. People still look up Al Capone biography because they want to understand how one man became the face of Prohibition-era Chicago. They want to know what was real and what was exaggerated. They want to know how much of the legend was built by fear and how much was built by newspapers. The truth sits in the middle. Capone was not the only gangster in America. He was not the only violent man. He was not the only boss. But he became the most famous because his story had everything that grabs attention. A poor beginning, a fast rise, a dangerous world, a public image, and a surprising fall. His life also shows a pattern that people recognize, even today. First, there is hunger. A young man wants respect. Then there is speed. He finds money fast and grows confident. Then there is power. People fear him, and he starts to believe he is untouchable. Then there is exposure. The more famous he becomes, the harder it is to hide. And finally, there is the fall. Not always from a rival's bullet, but from a system that waits. This is the lesson Capone's story offers. Power can make a man loud, but it cannot make him permanent. Some viewers will ask, did Capone ever feel guilty? The truth is, no one can fully read his heart. He did not leave behind a clear confession that explains everything. But his later life suggests something important. A man can build an empire and still end up alone with his thoughts. A man can win 100 battles and still lose the war against consequences. Other viewers will ask, why didn't they catch him for the violence? And that question is part of what makes the story so satisfying. It reminds people that the legal system does not always work the way movies show. Sometimes the law cannot prove the biggest crimes, so it uses the smaller door. That smaller door is what finally closes the cage, and that is why Capone's fall feels so ironic. He lived by fear and force, but he was defeated by paperwork and patience. In the end, the government did not need to match his violence. It only needed to outlast him. So what should people remember? Not the suits, not the headlines, not the nickname. They should remember that Capone's rise was not magic. It was a result of a broken time, a broken law, and a city full of corruption. Prohibition created a market, and Capone exploited it. Weak enforcement and bribery helped him grow. Fear helped him maintain control, and fame helped him become the symbol of it all. But his end also matters, because his end shows that a symbol can collapse. A man can lose the image he built. A name can become a warning instead of a crown, and that makes his biography more than a gangster story. It becomes a human story about ambition, identity, and what happens when a person chases power so hard that he forgets what a normal life feels like. Al Capone did not only build an empire, he built a legend. But legends do not protect the people inside them. They only make the fall louder. If you want the next real-life biography, comment next and choose one. Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, or Bumpy Johnson. And subscribe, because the next story is even more shocking and 100% real.